Okay, we will start. I will continue to let people in as they come into the meeting. Now they're all coming in. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us in a session which is, I'm sure, to be of interest to you all. The single employer model is a hot topic at the moment, and we know that there's lots of questions out there. So we've got a number of people online who are participating in current pilots or are overseeing the pilots and the work that's been happening. Before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we all meet on across the country. We're pretty much represented in every state, and also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Just a little bit of background. We held a session in Hobart as part of the Rural Medicine Australia conference, and for anyone that was there, it was a particularly popular session. It was only a half-hour session, but it was a popular one, and we thought that doing something online would give people another opportunity to hear more about the current pilots and also some of the work that RDAA has been doing in the background. I guess just by way of sort of some housekeeping, please keep yourself on mute unless you're speaking. If you have a burning question, please put it in the Q&A. We have activated the Q&A and we will try and get to as many questions as we can. Some people have emailed questions ahead of time, which is fantastic. So thank you to them. Just for, again, I suppose from an RDAA perspective, we are big supporters of single employer model, but with conditions. We're currently finalising our position statement on this. We had a lot of discussion at our board meeting in October on the single employer model and some key elements which we think are critical for the success. First and foremost, I think from an RDAA perspective, we do support an opt-in model, both for practices and registrars. And we think that that choice is important. We understand single employer model won't necessarily be for everybody. We're certainly, again, very supportive of the jurisdiction model, which is pretty much the subject of the pilots, although Tassie has expanded into GPs, and I know Alison Turnock is online and may be able to answer some questions on the Tassie pilot specifically if anyone has those. We're also very conscious that it is a very different arrangement, and every state has different, award entitlements and things like that. But again, we know that rural general practice is under a lot of pressure at the moment, and we talk about the risk to the viability of rural general practice. So RDAA does have a position that the financial risk should not sit with the general practice, particularly in the pilot stages, well, even going forward. But it's something that we need to monitor closely, as we do know that there's various reiterations of how funding is dispersed. We also need to make sure that the hospitals and the practices are fully cognizant of their responsibilities for the registrars to achieve their competencies and fulfill all their training requirements. So that absolutely has to be front of mind. There has been some discussion about cash out options in lieu of accrued entitlements or other arrangements. RDAA has taken a position that we would be against that. We are very conscious of what our doctors in training and the message they've given us around comparing the state award with general practice, and particularly for rural generalists who maintain an ongoing service in a state hospital service. We've flagged with the department, as have many of the peak bodies, that while the pilots are focused on registrars, we need to look at this model beyond the registrar years. And our immediate past president, Megan Bello, was a really good example of that. She had her baby as a fellow, her second baby as a fellow, and, you know, has had to take unpaid leave. So, you know, that is certainly front of mind, maybe a little bit of self-interest, but we know that she's not alone in that predicament. So that's something that we are really conscious of. And I guess, again, RDAA is keen to work with the states, participate in developing and designing their models, and working with the states to not criticise but provide productive feedback on the various pilots and as they're going. But so far our members have been particularly supportive of the models, and we are about to hear from Professor Paul Worley, and certainly the members that we have that are participating in the Riverlands pilot are very supportive and very complimentary of the way it's been designed. But rather than me talk about that, I'm going to hand straight over to Paul and let him speak on that. And again, if you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section, please. Paul, I'll hand over to you.
Nanawamichi Nankarinangi, Nanawamichi Paul Worley, Napi Purari Maori, Pambarakunk, Narrandjeri Rui. I'm here on Narrandjeri country. I'm a doctor who works for the Riverland Mallee Coorong Local Health Network in Murray Bridge. And importantly, I'm an RDA member. So this is members talking to members. And I welcome the opportunity to share some of the experience that we've had. Also want to acknowledge very much the work that Paul Maher and Jewel Ludford and Alam Yusuf did in the Murrumbidgee to develop this up, and also Alison Turnock and her team in Tassie, who are taking it to a whole of jurisdiction level. And to thank Ruth Stewart for her work taking over from me as National Rural Health Commissioner, but really making sure that along with the Commonwealth Department, the initiatives that were outlined in the National Rural Generalist Pathway are being put in place. And if you want to see where the single employer model genesis started, then go to that National Rural Health Commissioner pathway document, and you'll see there how it's contextualized and its importance. For those of you who have heard me speak in the past, you will realise that there are 3 points I want you to remember. Alison can probably tell you what the 3 points are, but I'll say it anyhow. You have to shear the whole sheep, never waste a crisis, and we have to change the narrative. They are all important when it comes to the single employer model. My role now, apart from being a practicing rural doc here on the Fleurieu, is to transform our local health network into a training network and a research network, similar to the expectation that clinicians and patients have in the city. We know what it takes to in terms of a training pathway to create a rural workforce. That knowledge has been constructed here in Australia and overseas, but what we've done is just implement little bits of it. And my main message to you is, if you think you can just implement the single employer model and nothing else, then you're just shearing the back leg of the sheep. And the rest of the sheep's going to get dags, going to get sick, going to get crook. You're not going to actually solve your problem, because that's what we've been doing. We've been doing, short-term rotations, or a little bit of this, or a little bit of incentives, or a little bit of recruitment payments, or some accommodation support, and thinking that if we just do this next one thing, that's all we'll need to do to solve the problem. We've recruited 30 new doctors to our region. We only had 100 FTE to start with, so we've increased by over 25% in 18 months. And the single employer model has been a critical part of that, but it hasn't been the whole part of that. We had to change the narrative about what it was to be a rural doctor. We formed the Riverland Academy of Clinical Excellence, not the Riverland Academy of we're so grateful you could come, and we realize you didn't do that well in your exams, so you don't get a chance at another specialty, but we'll have you anyway. So it's changing the narrative to one of, well, are you actually good enough to come and join us? Are you good enough for us to see you as worthwhile to invest in? Because the single employer model is an investment by the employer in residents and registrars through to their fellowship, because we think they're worth it. So it can't be just for whoever didn't get in elsewhere. We need to have really rigorous and a high bar in the selection process. And I recognise that, and we were no different. Many rural areas are doing it really tough. Years and years of Medicare underfunding, years and years of money being thrown, but the whole sheep not being shorn, and therefore the system not being fit for purpose. We've had to rely on trying to convince people who were somewhere else to come and work with us, and it's been a real struggle, crisis after crisis, and there are still crises today. The key is not wasting those crises by trying to keep things the way they were, but rather think, how can we use this crisis to set up a system for the way they need to be in the future? And a key part of that is listening to the doctors of the future, who are the residents and registrars. What have they told us? They've told us overwhelmingly that they need security and that they need stability in order to be able to plan. If they're going to be choosing a career, they're going to listen to their partner about where their partner wants to live. They're going to be thinking of their kids and where their kids are going to school. They're going to be thinking about their parents and what their parents' needs are. All of those social determinants of health. All of that gets down to the Aboriginal concept of country and community. So our program is very much, and I think the single employer model in many ways is modelled on an Aboriginal understanding of country and community. And we should acknowledge that strength that's in Australia because of the heritage we've got from Aboriginal people, and celebrate that and use it. So what does that mean? In practical terms, it means when we attract a graduate from medical school to be an intern in our region, we offer them a 5-year contract. That 5-year contract means that they can work with us until they become a fellow. If they're going to take a couple of years off to have babies or do other things, then we will extend that contract. Essentially, it's a contract through till they get their fellowship. We take the risk as the LHN. We took the risk before we had the single employer model 19.2 exemption. Why did we do that? Because if we just keep on doing the same old thing and expect to get a different answer, we're all crazy. So we needed to see these junior doctors as an investment. The single employer model and the 19.2 exemption has meant that it's far more financially viable for us to do this. Our locum bill is now a third of what it used to be, which is a very significant reduction for any of you who are in health services and know what the locum bills are. And that also means that we've got a far more local workforce, which means our care is better because everybody knows the policies and procedures and the protocols and is part of our education process, rather than us having to rely on people who've practiced somewhere else the day before and they're going, oh, so how do we do it here? No, they're part of the team. Yeah, recruited 25% increase in our medical workforce over the last 18 months, and that's increasing again next year. The LHN's taken the risk. If we'd just done this as an LHN, we would have a Queensland solution, which is fantastic for rural hospitals, but it's been awful for rural general practices. So you cannot do this if you are interested in rural generalism and just do this for the hospitals. It has to very much be in partnership with the practices. I can see Pete Rispeth is on the line. We've had people on our medical education committee designing this curriculum, designing our system alongside the heads of the hospital department. Equal, different, but equal. They're all consultants in our program. You can only do this if you have really good relationships with your practices. If you think you can institute a single employer model and you don't really know who the GPs are, or you're in a constant battle with them, then think again. Go somewhere else, because it won't work. This is not a hospital employment strategy. It's a strategy that is a private-public partnership. And that partnership is essentially built on trust. Yes, there are some contracts and memorandums of understanding that articulate what that trust means in practice, and they are important. But for instance, it took us 12 months to work out the details of what that funding split would look like between the practices and the hospitals. But that was never that contract was never a contingency on the project going ahead. There was always the agreement that we were going to do this because we needed to do it, and we would take the time it took to make sure we understood all of the nuances to get the contract as good as we could get it when we started. And if we change it over time, that will change. So what looks like a really simple thing, which is the practices get 50% of the Medicare billings and the hospital gets 50% of the Medicare billings, you'd think, well, that's a no-brainer. That's really easy. No, it's not. You have to go into a lot of detail to work out that both sides are actually having a fair deal with that. Who takes care of the leave? The hospital takes care of all the leave. We're the employer. We have been the employer since internship. We have developed systems so that we can provide the advanced skills training. Again, don't think about doing the single employer model if you can't do the advanced skills training in your region. Don't think about this if you can't do the junior doctor training in your region. It's all about enabling your trainees to see your region as their home while they're training. Because where their home is where their career will be. Why? Because that's where their partner and their social supports are going to be based. So they might say at the end of 5 or 6 years when they've been training with us, they might say, "Oh, I've seen this really interesting job over in Victoria. What do you reckon?" And their partner will go, "Tell her she's dreaming. The kids are in school here. We've got a family. This is where my parents are living. What? You're telling me to move? You got to be joking." Which is what we hear, isn't it, all the time with people who come out on a short-term rotation to rural. They say, "It's fantastic. Loved working in the practice, but my partner, my family, all of those things." This is flipping the model on the head. So you need to have the whole of the sheep. You need to have all of those other elements of the training pathway and the support network and the relationships with the practices so that they are seen as equal partners in a private-public partnership. The actual 19.2 exemption, in a way, Kathleen, is the simple bit. There's a very simple contract with the Commonwealth. Don't get freaked out by that. It's very simple, very transparent. For those of you who have had registrars in your practice, it really doesn't end up being that much different to having a registrar being able to bill when they're not a fellow. That requires another 19.2 exemption. From the same piece of legislation about being a GP registrar and not being a fellow, and yet being able to bill at fellow rates. Likewise, there are 19.2 exemptions for Aboriginal medical services. There are 19.2 exemptions for doctors who are working on a hospital site and need to be able to bill Medicare. But this is for doctors who are employed by the State Health Service, but they are working on, in, and for a private general practice. as part of their training to become a rural generalist. What have we found? We've found that a number of our registrars have actually chosen to be part single employer, part private. Is that strange? No, it's not strange. That's what a lot of us do anyhow, don't we? We have our private practice and we have our hospital work, and how the hospital work may be employed as a contractor or maybe employed as a salaried a part-time specialist, etc., etc. So they're starting to get paid and understand the payment systems that they're going to continue with. And as Peter said, we're expecting also that longer term, once they've fellowed, most of these practitioners will want to keep at least a part-time role with the LHN and a part-time role with the private practice. The balance of that will change probably with life stage and with different interests, and depending what their AST is as to whether that's something they practice in a hospital or they practice in a private clinic environment. So I hope that's given you a bit of an understanding. I reckon the better way is to discuss this with questions and answers. So I'm very happy to take any questions through you, Peter.
Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate it. And as I said, some people have emailed ahead. So for anyone online, if you wish to ask a question, maybe just either put it in the chat. It's probably the easiest bit. If you've got questions maybe about the Murrumbidgee model, I know Alarm is online, and as I said, Alison's online from Tassie. So there are some nuances to each of the models. So I think it's important to understand those a little bit as well. One of the questions that was sent through was, have you thought about if someone wants a temporary break from the model, like to do maybe a placement overseas or something like that?
Yeah, really good question. So we're actually negotiating at the moment with Alice Springs for our TMO and registrars to be able to do terms in Alice Springs. We've got relationships with Mildura, which is just across the border from the Riverland. Riverland Mallee Coorong basically follows the River Murray in South Australia, so it's that south and east part of the state. But it gets down to that social thing of, well, are they going to be able to convince their partner to go? That's what we're creating, is the scenario where all the social factors work in our advantage, and that's where their home is. That's where they're voting for their politicians. Yes, they may have an investment property in the city, but the city property is not their home. We don't pay accommodation. After 6 months, we give them a bit of help for the first 6 months. After that, people don't need accommodation. This is where they live. So yes, people certainly need to have the opportunity to do some special things as part of their training. That doesn't take them away from our single employer model any more than it takes a cardiology trainee away from their place of training if they go and do a fellowship in Duke University in the States, because they want to get some special skills and bring them back to Flinders Medical Centre or Royal Prince Alfred. So same model.
So same provisions of entitlements and arrangements.
Yeah.
Another question was, some registrars have recently negotiated enhanced remuneration through their fee for service. Do you have registrars or trainees that have elected to not participate at all in the single employer and just do the traditional sort of models, fee for service in the practice and a VMO contract with the hospital?
Yeah, we absolutely do. So we have we've given choice, and in a way, a little bit of it depends on how senior the registrar is and how confident they are that they can get high billings in the practice. So if they're a very senior practitioner who is classified as a registrar for training purposes, and they've done their sums and they reckon they can cram in a whole lot more patients as a trainee and get paid better in this, and realize that they're foregoing long service leave, they're foregoing their professional development leave, they're foregoing their maternity leave, they're foregoing the increased accrual of sick leave and all of those things. So, we make it really transparent to them. Then we're very supportive for them to take leave without pay from our system and to be employed privately. Most haven't decided to do that. There've been a number that have done a bit of each, and we've been quite comfortable in negotiating that. If you want a small sample, you would say that it's been rare for a female registrar to opt out of the system. It's been more common for a male registrar to opt out of the single employer model. And there are probably fairly logical reasons for that. Our registrars are having babies, they're getting married, they're buying houses, and the benefits of a single employer model, I think, are greater for female registrars.
Okay, there is a question, and this might actually be one that we can direct to Kathleen, who I'm going to hand over to in a minute. But what the question is there facility for university teaching, not in the practice, and possibly consultancy to be rolled somehow into the single employer pool, funds and benefits?
Hi, Kathleen here. I am a director in the Health Workforce Division, and I'm currently overseeing the macro policy rollout of the single employer model across the country, but that doesn't take away from the fantastic work that's happening on the ground in Riverland and Murrumbidgee, and also statewide in Tasmania, noting that they are really the brains behind the development of the specific models in their particular jurisdiction. From a funding perspective, the Commonwealth's contribution to single employer model as it stands is a Section 19.2 direction, which basically enables the practice or the employer to bill MBS billing with the addition of a state government employment arrangement. Generally, once those employment arrangements are in place, they're not able to actually bill MBS, but this provides them with the exemption that enables them to do that. The Commonwealth hasn't committed any additional funding at this stage to the jurisdictional single employer model trials, but it has committed a small amount of funding. It's around $4.5 million over 4 years, and that does extend out to about $6.4 million over 6 years for testing of market-based trials where the state government is not the employer, and we're certainly having a look at what innovative models that we can actually develop as a part of that. At the moment, we're negotiating with the Archers sector just to see if they're interested in specifically running a Archers focused, an Aboriginal health focused single employer model trial, but we're also in the process of negotiating and consulting more widely on what some of the options and innovations we might be able to look at as a part of that development. So I'm certainly happy to take that conversation offline regarding some of the opportunities that you've identified through that particular query. So wouldn't mind actually catching up with you separately.
Peter, it's Paul. It's Paul. It's here. Yep. I can add to that, and one of the things that sort of Kathleen alluded to around the training grant. For those of you who have an Aboriginal medical service or an Aboriginal community controlled health service, you will already have most likely a 19.2 exemption. So you don't need anything further to be able to do the single employer model with an Aboriginal medical service. You can already do that. For those of you who are practicing in a Monash 5 town or below that has a practice that is part of the hospital, in other words, it's a practice that's where the building's owned by the state and it's on the hospital location, and you have a 19.2 exemption to be able to work there, you don't need another exemption to be able to do this. So a lot of, for a lot of places, you can actually, if you want to start small, and do this, you can actually start already, and particularly the Aboriginal sector is advantaged in this regard. So yeah, don't shy away from that.
That's absolutely right, Paul. And we're not looking to create a hierarchy of Section 19.2 directions. And at the moment, the legal advice we're receiving is that we can't have 2 directions in one place. For single employer model participants, we create the Section 19.2 direction, but that absolutely does not preclude other services that already have that existing direction in place, such as ARCHESs, from participating in the trials. That just gives us a little bit more flexibility around the movement of participants through the SEM trials. And from a Commonwealth perspective, we don't see any barriers across jurisdictions as well. As Paul indicated, there are some registrars who are looking to go off into different jurisdictions and do placements, and that would notionally, Paul, please correct me if I'm wrong, that would notionally be separate to the SEM pilot that's occurring in the Riverland. But from the Commonwealth's perspective, when you're looking at towns across borders, such as Mildura, or for example in the Tweed Heads potentially, and the Gold Coast region, we certainly see some opportunities to have some cross-jurisdictional arrangements. We're providing jurisdictions with, I suppose, the imprimatur to develop the trials where they think they're needed and the business models as they think they are best suited to the particular locations in which they're situated. So we're certainly giving jurisdictions a lot of freedom and flexibility around that. We don't want to impose a whole heap of restrictions from a Commonwealth perspective, but we also recognise the need for it to be as flexible as possible. And I'd just like to reiterate what Peter said before about the need for SEM to be based on voluntary participation. That is certainly the Commonwealth's view at this point in time. These are trials that are being run out. No decision has been made around the permanent arrangement that is occurring. Yes, there have been feasibility studies looking at different options, and we have the trial which will kick off next year in 2024, which will give us a lot more information around how we move forward in a more permanent sense. But certainly we recognise the importance of that voluntary aspect, both for registrars and also for participants. And just circling back to the question as well before around what some of the more innovative models might be moving forward as to how we can bring in more of the university sector, for example. We're certainly happy to have those discussions and to work through from an innovative perspective what we can do to encourage more junior doctors to choose general practice and, most importantly, rural generalism.
Thanks, Kathleen. There is a question in the Q&A from Elizabeth regarding the New South Wales proposal and the financial risk being placed on the practices. And just to flag, Elizabeth, that's been a hot topic within the RDA New South Wales and RDAA, and there's some correspondence and feedback going back to Ministry on their proposal. However, I would like to talk to Paul and to Alam, and Alison, if you want to jump in as well, but I'll go to Paul first. You've got a 50-50 split in place, and another question came through. There is a concern, particularly for GP1 registrars, that they won't earn enough, to cover, particularly if they've got to pay the hourly rate back to the jurisdiction. That's a concern. But, with the 50-50 split, is that covering, say, the practice overheads, at least over, say, the longer term, maybe not the first 3 months, but, do they start to pick up enough patients per hour that, financially, the risk is not risk is minimised for the practice?
Thanks, Peter. So our Director of Clinical Training is also a practice owner in the region. And so in some ways he's been negotiating with himself around this, which is always good to have someone who understands both sides, hey? But the bottom line is that we are very confident that the practices will not be worse off. In fact, we think they will be better off for 2 reasons. One, they are not picking up any of the leave. So we've just made it very simple that leave is the responsibility of the employer, and that's the responsibility of our LHN. And so previously they would have had to be paying leave when there was no patients being billed. So they're getting all of that out of the way. But secondly, I said you have to share the whole sheet. So the registrars they're getting as GP1, they've already had as interns and as PGY2s, and they're seeing more patients than their third or fourth or fifth year standard GP registrars already in GP1. So you know, if we're not, if people are not seeing, doing a good enough job in GPT1, that's because we're not getting them into GP in intern and RMO and preparing them properly. We can have people doing very, very well. And that's, again, that's one of the reasons why some of our trainees are saying, no, I think I'll take the fee for service option because I've done so much stuff in general practice already. I reckon I can see the patients and do extra procedures in the treatment room and this, that, and the other. And I've done the sum. So it can't be based on, oh, they've done a couple of years in the city and now they're coming out and we've got to orient them to general practice. No, they're already in general practice before they become a registrar. That's the whole sheep. That's the model. Alan?
Thanks, Peter. Look, I think the best option is to know whether it is who's taking the financial risk is to talk to GP practices who are doing it already. You can talk to Jan, Kuta, Mandra, Timora. I'm more than 100% sure that they're doing better off with this version compared to the standard process. And that's what the practices have told me. In Murrumbidgee model, our split is not 50-50. Our split is about, recuperating the hourly rate for the number of hours the registrar spends face-to-face time. Pretty much it becomes the same though, only version is that conceptually we didn't want to have a percentage in our contract. So that's the deal there. But if you look at all the numbers, how the financial modeling was initially formulated when we first went into a MOU in 2020, October with the federal government, it wasn't with the tripling of bulk billing rate either, right? This was in the traditional version numbers that we used in 2020s. That's how we conceptualized the financial modeling. So it is far better now compared to that modeling. From November this year, the practices will be far better off. So next year come, you will see that practices will be looking at, there are a few nuances though, like what Paul said, we'll have to work around what is right for certain places. Like we have 2 registrars in our patch, which we don't call them there in the Murrumbidgee model because they're not on a single employment model because they can see a lot more patients as a much more mature registrar. So we have employed them in a different version of contract, but we think single employer model is a misnomer. We think the real game is about the local health districts or local health networks collaborating and personalizing the process to fit for purpose for the region. Like I couldn't have eloquently elaborated like what Paul did for the last 20 minutes. He only took 22 minutes and he told the story like a very, very simply. So that's great. Thanks, Paul, for that and for your support when we were rolling out as being the first National Rural Health Commissioner and the influence that you had on our trial to be rolled out. Look, I would say if you have connections and stuff, have a make a call for one of those practices and see. My financial data and my feedback from all the practices and the registrars and practice owners, including practice managers, is that they're not worse off, rather they're better off. In fact, they call me 2-3 months before the recruitment starts saying, look, instead of the standard pathway, can I get a bit many more of these, 2 or 3 extra of these type of registrars into my practice? So if the practices aren't worse off or having more risk onto their head, they wouldn't be asking that for me. So I'm pretty confident that things are going good in both ways. But, in Murrumbidgee's perspective, we are a big district in the sense, huge, twice as big as Tasmania with 300,000 people. And as a health district, we are a big business. We have about $800 million turnout per year. These GP practices are small GP practices. Some of them are in rural areas, struggling to exist. So MLHD, Murrumbidgee, takes this serious, and we take the risk of governance and finance, which will not be a problem for GP practices. All what it comes to, I mean, you can elaborate on this better than me, Paul. All what it comes to is trust. Once the trust is built, and once the district and the participating private practices know each other and talk to each other very openly, there isn't a lot of problems. Things happen a lot easily.
Okay, I might just jump to Alison, if that's okay, Alison. I'll put you on the spot. Just to maybe give us a little bit of an overview of what's going on in Tassie, and any insights from Tassie.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Peter. And thanks to Paul and Alan, who really helped us get set up in Tassie too when we were developing our particular model down here. We took the approach that we wanted to co-design it with everybody that was going to be involved with the models. So we did that with the GP organisations, the colleges, RDAT, AMA, the universities, all of the stakeholders that we could find, as well as the medical students, the junior doctors and the registrars and the supervisors. So we took the approach that if it didn't work for any one group of people, it just wasn't going to work. So we took the approach that we would work with everybody to make it fit for our local circumstances. And we actually ended up on the same split as South Australia, the 50%. Another reason for choosing that is that it reflected very much what was already happening in general practice under the NTCER. So we didn't want to create an environment in general practice where general practices or registrars wanted to be one or the other because it was significantly financially different. The point of the single employer model was to remove the disincentive of a change in employment arrangements for the registrars that gave them the confidence to step out of the hospital into general practice. And so that's the aim of the single employer model from our perspective. And that confidence and that might extend for them through the entirety of their GP training, or it might, after the first 3 months of their GP training, they and the practices might decide to step off the single employer model and do their usual sort of fee-for-service NTCER type arrangements. So that's kind of the approach that we've taken in Tasmania. At the moment, the reason that I'd say I think it's working okay is in the first 6 months this year, we've had 5 registrars participate. We had a number of practices interested in participating, and there've been one in Burnie, which is an MMM3 area, one in Deloraine, which is an MMM5 area, one in Swansea, which is an MMM6 area, and 2 in an MMM2 area in Hobart and Brighton, both of which are Aboriginal controlled community health organisations. So they're the 5 that we started with. Those 5 are looking to continue into next year. And currently we have another 15 that want to join us in January, with 43 practices that are going to be added to our 19.2 direction list, not including the Aboriginal controlled community health organisation. So it's more like 45 or something like that. So I think there really is interest both from the practices and from the registrars. And I think it's, it'll be interesting to see where it goes, but happy to answer any questions.
Okay, still looking at the questions coming through online, but just one of the questions, and I'll ask Paul and Alison this, but the question of like previous service recognition, I guess, these are pilots, and it may not be in this reiteration, but down the track. But, looking at that person who may come into the system later, do you think if it goes beyond fellowship in particular, do you think the model is set up that we can bring people in as late entries into the SEM arrangement? So sort of as I don't think it's a question for now because it'd be out of scope, but I think it could be a question for a later
Nice.
reiteration of it.
From our perspective, Peter, it's actually fully in scope. So
Okay.
when we're looking to employ a trainee medical officer, whether they be at intern, resident, or registrar level, we have to work out, well, where do they fit in our system in terms of their payment, and they may be at a PGY 9 level. So they start at a PGY 9, and we just say, if you came in and were part of dermatology training program, what would you get paid? Well, we'll pay you the same because that's you're employed by us. So I don't see a problem there. In terms of our fellows, they get employed as consultants in the same way as a fellow of the College of Surgeons or a fellow of the College of Physicians. So to me, it very much is around treating rural generalist trainees the same as we treat any other trainees, and that doesn't stop at PGY 2, 3, 4, 5. It depends what their history is, and certainly we've had a number of people. So so what's been interesting for us is for those locums that we have had, a number of them are in that hospitalist locum sort of merry-go-round where they can earn a whole lot of money, but they get to a point where they go, I'm earning a whole lot of money, but I'm not going anywhere. And they look at our training program and they go, oh, that looks interesting. Can I join? And we say, yeah, sure. You'll have to commit. Are you good enough? We'll interview you and see. But we've had a number of people join us, ex-locum. And that's, there's a big group of quite talented doctors out there who are making a whole lot of money through locums at the moment, who are getting to that stage of going, oh, it might be useful to get a fellowship at some stage. This is a good model to get them into rural journalism rather than they go down the FACEM route and end up back in the cities.
Okay, excellent answer.
I'm
Just
seeing
from
the same though,
sorry,
Paula,
Alan.
Peter. Sorry,
Yep.
just adding on to it. I'm seeing the same. I'm having few conversations with registrars who've been working as CMOs, locums now that who wanted to have some time for themselves, some time to study and complete a fellowship. They're looking at this pathway as a secure way that they'll have a secure income while they have enough time to do the studying and settling in a region. So I'm having the same discussion with 3 people at the moment with the new year to come. So that is a newer aspect of SEM that we're seeing.
It's certainly one of the reasons one of our SEM registrars joined the program in the last 6 months to provide them the confidence to sit their exams knowing what their income would be. So far, so good.
Alison, you mentioned how many practices are sort of interested in Tassie, and there's just a question in there about, given that it's on trust, how can we, trust that this model won't be made mandatory? I guess from a practice perspective, even if it's not mandatory to participate, do you think that there'll be, like, the registrars themselves will talk, or it's just something that the practices will probably have to at least have in their back pocket as an option to be in the market for registrars? I'll go to you first and then I'll go to Paul.
Yes, I think it probably works both ways. So the timing of the college placement processes and the SEM direction lists and hospital recruitments don't quite line up yet. So there's definitely a lot of talking that goes on. But from a practice perspective, to be included on the 19.2 direction list, it doesn't lock you into having a SEM registrar, nor does it guarantee you a SEM registrar. So to be on the list is fairly low risk. It means that you can participate should you match with the right registrar and want to participate. But if you're on the list and you don't want to participate, that is also absolutely fine. So low risk for the practice. But what it does mean is if you've got a number of registrars coming to you with an interest at working at your practice during the placement process, you can offer it as an option. And so you can then have the conversation with your registrar. Would you like to be here with us under the NTCER, or would you like to be here with us under SEM? So we actually had a couple of practices not initially put an EOI in, but then after chatting with the registrars about practice placement and the registrar saying, look, I've got an interest in this, then the practices have reached out and sought some more information to consider whether they'd like to be involved. I guess in regards to the voluntary nature of it, that is part of our 19.2 MOU with the Commonwealth at the moment. So the Commonwealth mandates us all to make this voluntary. But from a state perspective, even despite that, same as what Paul and Alan have said, there is generally a gap between the percentage that comes back to the state and what the registrars are receiving as an employee. So it costs the state money to have the trainees under the single employer model. So should a practice and a registrar come to us and say, hey, you know what, we think we do better under the NTCER or, direct engagement as a contractor, if that's a win-win for them, it's a win for us too. We've got somebody in general practice who's continuing under the normal general practice model that's better off that way. And it then doesn't cost the state that gap. So I think it's a win for everyone. So I can't see why we would change it from being voluntary when it works for everybody at the moment.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. Certainly, Peter, the registrar network talks, and I recall somebody asking a question: would artificial intelligence replace doctors in the future? And this WizKids answer was no, but doctors who use artificial intelligence will replace doctors who don't. And I think it's the same with the single employer model option being available in your practice. Will single employer model replace private contracting and other employment models? No, but practices that have this in their kit bag and have this as an option because they respect the needs of different types of registrars will replace those who don't in terms of access to high quality registrars.
Yep. I do want to touch base, Kathleen, just to come back to you, because obviously while we've got the jurisdiction pilots, in the background there's also been a lot of discussion on the broader GP employment reform, and the department engaged KPMG to look at the potential options. Can you give us an update from the Commonwealth's perspective of where that is up to? And I guess just, what the thinking is, and, not that you can commit to anything, but just a bit of an update on where that's up to, and maybe a little very brief summary of the different recommendations or the models that were in play.
Yeah, of course. So the Commonwealth decommissioned KPMG last year to undertake a feasibility study, and initially the focus of that feasibility study was on a portability scheme, but then the scope of that particular work was expanded out to include a national single employer model feasibility study, and also to look at options with respect to paid parental leave provisions, and study incentive provisions that could be implemented as well. The intent was to consider the viability of those three options, but not necessarily to consider them as mutually exclusive options per se, simply to do individual feasibility studies on each of those policy reform potential options moving forward, and provide advice to government. KPMG have delivered their final report to us, which we have been consulting with the sector on. It does recommend that paid parental leave and study incentive payments can be implemented as I suppose, a quick win reform, something that could be put in place relatively quickly and easily. Obviously, this national single employer model, which if it was to be national, it recommended that it would have to be a mandatory approach. And the portability scheme option, they're far more complex. There's a whole heap of constitutional issues that would need to be resolved if either of those options were to be implemented. And there are some significant implications that we would need to consider from an outcomes perspective, and that does include the potential for perverse outcomes. The study did recommend, from a long-term reform perspective, it did recommend the national single employer model based on the consultations that we've been having to date with the sector. There's mixed views, certainly, and lots of different views out there as to what the best option would be moving forward. But certainly we have heard a lot of feedback with respect to the risk of adopting a national mandatory approach. And we're certainly taking that feedback on board around the future direction of single employer model. With these feasibility studies taking place, it does provide us with, I suppose, and some early advice around the considerable complexities that we would need to consider with reform in this space. We are hearing loud and clear from the sector that there does need to be reform and that we do need to look at entitlements and remuneration within the GP training context. So we have heard that very, very clearly. We do have the evaluation for the single employer models, and that's all the single employer models that are being rolled out under the Commonwealth 19.2 directions. So that does include what's occurring in Riverland and also Murrumbidgee. Thank you very much, Paul, and Alarm, and Tasmania being already underway. And it does include the expansion to New South Wales, which will notionally progress from the beginning of next year, the proof of concept trials that will notionally progress in Queensland from early next year, and those that progress beyond that as well. That evaluation has not commenced. We do need touch points very early on and throughout the evaluation process so that we can make a decision on where we're going with single employer model. That decision obviously has not been made in the absence of the evaluation even commencing. So as far as firm decisions on one particular way forward, certainly take on board a lot of the feedback that we've received that the Commonwealth should just do something and do something now and make it happen. But we need to be very considered about the approach that is being taken. And certainly we do see the value as to what's been occurring from a place-based perspective, both in Race and Murrumbidgee, which has seen some fantastic outcomes, and also in the Tasmania context, the statewide approach. With 45 practices interested and an increasing number of registrars, that's really encouraging. We do need to understand some of the outcomes that will be emerging from some of the more broader collaborative trials as well, just around the viability of that approach and whether that is particularly the best approach to take in certain contexts or whether there is some more benefit from a place-based approach. So the short answer is no decision has been made at this point in time as to the firm direction forward, but just want to make it very clear that the trials that are being rolled out at the moment under the Commonwealth's macro policy approach, that's not with a national mandatory lens. That is very much, these are pilots. We're relying on jurisdictions to tell us how best they think these pilots should be rolled out in each jurisdiction. It's not mandatory for practices. It's not mandatory for registrars. And we're simply testing a number of different approaches, and it's not with the natural progression foreseen conclusion that it would lead to a national model. That decision hasn't been made. And as I said before, we're receiving a lot of different feedback from across the sector, which we need to listen to very carefully, and we'll be taking that on board. And we do want to thank Peter and RDAA for all the fantastic advice and feedback we've received, but also more broadly through stakeholders such as GPSA. I think they're online as well. We've received some very important feedback through a lot of key organisations and stakeholders, and we appreciate that and we're listening to that.
Thanks, Kathleen. I'm just conscious of time, so I might just go to Alarm, then Alison, and then we'll finish with wise words from Paul. Just some final comments in relation to the single employer model. So Alarm, I'll come to you first.
Thanks. In short, this is not the answer for all the problems, but certainly a way to have local graduates graduating and completing their complete training in your own patch, and them, developing into senior clinicians in the region. That's the game, and single employment model is one way of it.
Thank you. Alison.
Yeah, thank you. I think probably what I'd say is if you're developing in your state, I would really recommend you talking to as many of your stakeholders as possible and designing this with them. They'll actually design it in a way that's going to work for you, and then they'll all be on board as well at the same time. I think if you don't have a GP involved in that from your organisational perspective, it would be challenging. So I'd encourage that as well if that's not already the case.
Okay. And Paul, I'll leave the final word to
Yeah,
you.
thanks, Peter. The single employer model really is enabling people to train the way they're going to practice and to train in the location they practice. When I was Dean of Medicine, I had to learn why are the cardiologists so interested in teaching so much of the curriculum in a medical school? Well, the reason is they want to identify the best students, encourage them to become cardiologists, to do their internship with them, to do their residency, to do their registrar training, send them off for a fellowship, and then come back and be their colleagues. Single employer model gives us locally the capability to do the same thing in rural generalism, to identify our best young graduates and say, do you want to be part of our practice long term? We now have the tools in our toolkit to enable that to happen, as long as, and this is where Alan and Alison have also emphasised, we have all those other bits in the picture. And to do that, you need to have a Jill Ludford. You need to have a Wayne Champion. You need to have your local CEO who says, this is really important. This is not about second-class stuff. This is absolutely mission critical to our local health network and the practices that we trust in and support. That's why I think it works so much better rural, and it's great to have RDA supporting this sort of knowledge dissemination. Like Alan, if anyone wants to come and speak to any of our practices or speak to any of our registrars, then please do. We're open 24/7. That's what happens in rural medicine, and people would love to talk at any time. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Colleen, to Kathleen, sorry, and also to Alexis. I know Alexis has been online, closely monitoring everything Kathleen says, but Kathleen's done a great job in helping us understand where things are up to. So really appreciate the time that she's given us as these single employer pilots develop. Thank you to everyone who's joined us, and hopefully we've answered some of your questions. There continues to be a lot of interest, and as things continue to develop, RDAA will certainly try and communicate as much information and share the experiences as best we can. So thank you for joining us, and we have recorded it. So if you want to sit there and replay this whole hour again, you can do that at your leisure. Okay. Thanks, everyone, and we'll talk again soon. Bye.